President Trump's decision to unilaterally withdraw from hard-won international agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, is, I think, a cause of concern. Now, while agreeing with the Minister that states need to honour the commitments that they've entered into, does he agree with me that it sends a damaging message about the need for international agreements to solve the problems of the world when the United States of America, it seems, can no longer be relied upon to uphold agreements it has freely entered into?
Minister.
He will be aware that this government has equal concerns about the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and we think it is greatly to be regretted that the US decided to withdraw from that agreement. But I would reiterate, as I said at the outset, it is important to recognise the US have not yet withdrawn from this treaty. It is the work of allies, particularly here in the European continent, not least the big E3, United Kingdom, Germany and France, to try and put as much pressure as possible on this regard. But the easiest way of getting this matter resolved is to ensure that a bilateral arrangement that has now been in place for 31 years is adhered to by one of the parties that is not doing so. I don't think there's been any sense, and I think in a way this is boiling over frustration, and as I've again pointed out, this is not something that is new to the Trump administration. This has been a quite high-profile issue going back almost half a decade during the time of the Obama administration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will agree none of us want to see a return to the era when there were thousands of short and intermediate range nuclear warhead missiles delivery systems in Europe that potentially could be used at a moment's notice to start a world war. But would he also agree with me that when we see Russia having developed a new missile system that is potentially in breach of this treaty, that we also need to be very clear that actually this treaty is not going to survive if one party ignores its obligations under it?
I thank my honourable friend for Torbay. I mean, he's right. And they're very deep-seated concerns, by no means just US concerns, but concerns from all allies about Russia's development of new missile systems are long-standing and shared really by all NATO allies, not least those who are close to the Russian border. So consistently, along with NATO allies, supported by US efforts to bring Russia back into compliance, we did so as recently as the NATO summit that took place in July.
Chris Bryant.
One of the disturbing things that President Trump has added to this conversation is that he said he's not convinced by the treaty because it doesn't include China and that China is increasing its arsenal. Doesn't that suggest that there is something in the mind of the President of the United States of America which would quite like an escalation of nuclear weaponry? And that is something to be abhorred by all of us, isn't it?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman will recognise that that is in the realms of speculation in part, and as many other members will know, it is Russia and the US who are alone the countries who are bound by a treaty that obviously impacts on many other countries across the world, in particular within Europe. We are engaging and will continue to engage with the United States administration to understand their assessment, and obviously I too have read some of the speculation to which he refers. But fundamentally, this is a treaty that concerns Euro-Atlantic security and can only be effective if there is full compliance.
Tom Pursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend confirm for the House what specific engagement there has been with representatives of both the US administration but also the Russian authorities on these matters?
I hope that my honourable friend from Corby will recognise that I don't want to get into too many matters which are of sensitive intelligence in terms of verification and other issues, but clearly there are lines of communications open, not just with the US. I mean, one of the benefits of a frustrating bilateral relationship is between the UK and Russia. We are members of the UN Security Council. There are opportunities to be able to engage on a very regular basis, and please be assured that we will continue to do so.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a continuing undermining of the international order by many nations across the world, including Russia and China. So what are the UK government going to do to ensure that the upholders of the international order, meaning NATO, the UN, US, Britain and Europe, make the case that the person who's undermining it, President Trump, has to show an example, otherwise we can't make the argument to other countries?
Minister.
As I say, I understand where the honourable gentleman for Edinburgh South comes from on this matter and wants to criticise the US administration. The truth of the matter is that there has been frustration on this particular issue, as I say, for over half a decade. We are working closely and do work closely with the US to try and ensure nuclear non-proliferation. we are living in a world, and I would agree with him, that it is a great concern that from a number of unexpected quarters, there are continued threats towards a rules-based international system which has stood the world in very good stead over the past 7 decades. It is something that I spend quite a lot of time in the Foreign Office. I know that my Secretary of State, the new Foreign Secretary, feels as strongly about this and will be wanting to speak very openly about that rules-based system going forward.
Speaker, could I thank the Labour front bench for tabling the urgent question and you for accepting it? But does the Minister share my concern that there wasn't a breath in the Labour front bench's comments on this matter critical of Russia for not being in compliance with this treaty? And will the Minister agree with me that there's no point in having international treaties unless both signatories adhere to those terms?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for Kettering in his usual robust style. I think it is, in fairness, that there was a slightly more even-handed approach to this matter than he is giving the front bench credit for. But I think it is worth reiterating the point that my honourable friend makes, that ultimately we would not have come to this pass had Russia adhered to its compliance obligations.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. Just to be quite clear, if the INF Treaty falls apart, that would mean the relocation of short-range and medium-range nuclear missiles on UK soil. Considering that the British government has not been critical of the diplomatic moves by President Trump, can I take it that the British government will not stand in the way of the relocation of these missiles on UK soil?
Minister.
The honourable gentleman will recognise this is highly speculative, several steps ahead, and we are doing our level best to ensure that the INF Treaty is not torn up and thrown away for the reasons that I have pointed out. And for so long as the treaty remains in force, we shall continue with our efforts to bring Russia back into a full and verified compliance.
Mr. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend referred to the ongoing work on multilateral nuclear disarmament. Could he just express what the United Kingdom is doing? It's absolutely vital that far more visible work is done on this globally, as well as seeking to maintain these other treaties, which are a vital stepping stone towards that.
I reassure my friend from Stafford that a lot of work does go on. It's often said that the best way of keeping matters secret in the British public life is to say something on the floor of the House of Commons. Maybe the floor of the UN Security Council also provides the same anonymity. The truth of the matter is, and I'm very struck whenever I go, as I say, out to New York, just how many nations, particularly those who are perhaps non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, feel as strongly about the non-proliferation issue, and it is something that we continue to work very closely on. And obviously with all of the issues around DPRK that have been at the forefront of people's minds over the past year, there is never a more important time to make the robust case to which he refers.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia's non-compliance with this treaty is very serious. Can I press the Minister, however, what assurances about short and medium-range missile deployment in Europe has the Minister gleaned from our US partners?
Minister.
Listen, it's a fair question to ask, and if I hadn't answered it entirely before, he will realise this is sheer speculation. I mean, we're a long way off the idea of having to take assurances about where the sighting of any weapons may or may not come. And obviously, one of the biggest concerns we have is that the immediate instinct from President Putin was to come out and make a rather destabilising and an uncalled for comment about further threat in this regard. Our hope is that both parties will return to the table to be able to look at this treaty, but that does require goodwill, and goodwill particularly on the Russian side.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the UK has a long and strong interest in this treaty, thanks in no small part to Margaret Thatcher, bringing the two sides together historically. And tempting it is for some in this place to enter into a little bit of America bashing, can the Minister confirm that it is Russia, not the US, that is in breach of this treaty?
I thank my honourable friend from Mid Worcestershire for robustly putting that case, and he's absolutely right. It is this whole issue has come to pass because of the continued and long-standing non-compliance from Russia on this matter. And the truth of the matter, as I've said, is that this is not just an issue for the Trump administration. Very robust action was taken in 2014 and grave concerns raised about the failure of Russia to adhere to its obligations.
Speaker, the Minister will recall that yesterday was the actual anniversary of the founding of the United Nations in 1945. And in 1945, some real statesmen and women got together and said, how do we stop these world wars? How do we stop this chaos? How do we stop the killing? And they came up with the United Nations, they came up with the NATO, and they came up with what was the cold and steel community that became the European Union. Isn't it the fact that what we have to do now is to realise what perilous terms we are in and find the unity in Europe to make a contribution to the peace?
I would accept, and I think understandably we very much take it for granted, and I often reflect, I'm the father of a 10-year-old son, and we've perhaps taken for granted that he is the third generation of field menfolk who've not had to go to war, and that is the exception rather than the rule, and we should be very much aware of that. I am a great believer in utilising the strongest possible bilateral and multilateral communications that we can in diplomacy terms. And one thing I would like to reassure the Honourable Gentleman for Huddersfield on is this, that when we do leave the European Union, one thing that has been very evident in all of the discussions since that fateful day in June of 2016, when we made that decision, is that we have to work together in security, defence and intelligence. And in many ways, I think we have focused so much of our minds on that, and we will continue to do so even outside the European Union.
Just recently in the summer, John Huntsman, the US ambassador to Russia, described the INF as probably the most successful treaty in the history of arms control. Does the Minister agree with John Huntsman? And if so, will he be making that point to both the US and Russian governments as he meets them?
I think it's fair to say, if I may, to the Honourable Gentleman from Leeds, that, as I say, there are a number of other treaties that have also come into place since then, and that treaty obviously has particular resonance here in mainland Europe and in Europe as a whole. But the truth of the matter is that, that there has been a New START treaty. There are constant discussions taking place to try and ensure there is non-proliferation going forward. So yes, I think it is clearly in its own hands an important treaty, but it is a treaty signed between two countries, and obviously we would like to see one of those two countries that is clearly in breach of it coming back to the table, and only when that happens can we be sure that its stability and the stability that came into place on the signing 31 years ago will maintain.
Speaker, regrettably both Trump and Putin would seem committed to tearing up the international rule-based order. So what specific initiatives does the Minister see the UK taking with the European Union to bolster this international rules-based order so that we can ensure there is a focus on reducing nuclear weapons but also tackling other global issues like climate change?
I think it is wrong to suggest that America are trying to tear up the international order, although there are more threats to it than perhaps have hitherto been the case in years gone by. We will work together in as many international institutions as we can, and the Right Honourable Gentleman will be aware that Germany actually joins the UN Security Council in January of next year for a 2-year term, and we definitely see tremendous important work to take place between France, Germany and the UK in that forum to try and hold things together.
Dr. David Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the politics of brinkmanship is that it takes you to the brink. Isn't it about time that the government used the so-called special relationship to tell President Trump that?
I'm sorry, I mean, rather than just perhaps reiterating what I've said for the last half an hour, the truth of the matter is we have reached this point because Russia has persistently and consistently failed to meet its obligations. I think the important thing is not that we turn our fire in the opposite direction, but that we work together with all of our allies, and we are united amongst our NATO allies here in Europe, to ensure that Russia does do as it has adhered to.
Mr. Speaker, you know that I am by nature a conviction optimist, but that optimism is being sorely tested, and more importantly that of my constituents in Bristol West, who turned to me over the weekend for hope and reassurance about the international rules-based order. So I asked the Minister from the heart, what help can he give me to pass on optimism and hope for a better world?
Well, I am by nature a glass half full person. I'm sure the Honourable Lady will be glad to know. And the serious issue is we have to continue to talk. We have to continue to make the case internationally along the lines that she has said. And the one thing I would say is that NATO, all of our NATO allies, are totally united on this issue. That consistent message is that Russia has a key role in preserving that treaty and to make it aware of that key role, which we agree has been a very important pillar of the European Security Agreement. But I think I would just say to her, please do not be pessimistic. One of the things about diplomacy, and I know that a lot of it goes on under the radar, but we are working together with all of our allies in this particular space, but also generally where there are other breaches of the rules-based international system.
And Mrs. Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The INF Treaty has been important across the NATO alliance in preventing miscalculation. Across the alliance has also been concern about Russia's failure to comply. Can the Minister confirm that advance notice was given to the alliance of the American stance and that he will press that America keeps members of the alliance up to date and informed as to America's position in relation to any cancellation of the treaty?
I'm very happy to confirm that we shall do that. And I would reiterate the point. The US are still in this treaty, and we will continue to engage routinely with the widest range of foreign policy and security issues with the US and indeed with other partners in this regard.
Thank you. Order. Just before we come to the business question, I wish to make a few brief remarks. I am delighted that the House of Commons Commission has decided to support fully the three main recommendations from Dame Laura Cox's report, namely the removal of the previous complaints procedures that are considered not fit for purpose, the call for an entirely independent process to handle complaints, and the inclusion of historical allegations. I believe that this is an important first step in our root and branch reform of the culture of this House. We need to create an internal movement which looks at everything and everyone and ensures that we all treat each other with respect. We know that more than 200 people came forward to give their testimonies to help Dame Laura form her opinions, and we owe it to each and every one